I have a right to be here, officer. My client is inside.
You need to step back, counselor. This is an active scene.
Your client needs to cooperate, counselor. We have witnesses placing him at the scene.
My client asserts his innocence, officer. We will see you in court if necessary.
Aware of the tension in his shoulders, the way his pulse skipped every time a patrol car idled too close. "Sir, step out of the vehicle." The voice was flat, laced with authority and disdain. James froze. The patrol car's spotlight cut across his face, glinting off his gold cufflinks. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had only stopped at the crosswalk to let a group of pedestrians pass. Yet the officer's eyes scanned him like he carried a crime in his skin. James obeyed, forcing calm into his measured words. "Good morning, officer. May I ask why you stopped me?" The officer smirked, a twitch in his jaw, as if amused by the question itself. "You're dressed fancy, driving a nice car, but I know the type. Thought I'd see what you're up to." James' stomach knotted. Every instinct screamed injustice, humiliation, power misused. People across the street were watching, whispering, their faces frozen in discomfort or fear. "You don't belong here," the officer muttered under his breath, loud enough for James to hear. Something in James snapped, not anger, not yet, but awareness. The wrong assumption, the bias, the unknown authority, it all pressed against him like a tightening vice. A single hand on the officer's car hood, a whispered, "You're making a mistake." The officer glanced up, grin fading, tension crackling in the humid air. The world seemed to hold its breath. James felt the weight of everything, his identity, his work, his silence, balanced on the edge of one snap. Then the officer reached for his radio. The street was slick with the remnants of a midnight rain, and James Holloway's shoes clicked sharply against the pavement. He adjusted the cuff of his navy suit jacket, feeling the weight of his leather briefcase in his hand. The downtown streets were mostly empty, the streetlights flickering and casting fractured shadows across parked cars. He exhaled slowly, aware of the tension coiling in his chest. A patrol car hummed behind him, the engine idling. James kept walking, his gaze fixed on the crosswalk ahead. "Sir, step out of the vehicle." James froze. The voice was flat, clipped, authoritative. He glanced over his shoulder. A white male officer, mid-30s, uniform crisp, eyes narrow, was approaching. The officer's hand rested on the car door, fingers drumming lightly on the metal. "Good morning, officer," James said evenly. "May I ask why you stopped me?" The officer smirked, a twitch in his jaw. "You're dressed fancy, driving a nice car. Thought I'd see what you're up to." James' pulse quickened. He forced calm into his words. "I was waiting to let pedestrians cross. I assure you, nothing illegal is happening." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You don't belong here." James' stomach knotted. People across the street had stopped to watch, whispers and sidelong glances punctuating the humid air. The officer leaned slightly closer, his voice lowering so that only James could hear. "You think you're above the rules. People like you never learn." James' hand brushed against the leather strap of his briefcase. His mind raced, not with fear, but awareness. Bias, assumption, authority wielded unjustly. He could feel the weight of every injustice he had ever faced pressing down in this moment. "You're making a mistake," James said softly, measured, controlled. The officer's smirk faltered. He reached for his radio. James felt the tension spike, a snap line between restraint and chaos. Every muscle in his body tensed. The city seemed to hold its breath. From across the street, a passerby lifted a phone, the glow of the screen reflected in the puddles, a small, silent act that could ripple outward. The officer spoke into the radio. Words James couldn't yet hear. A hand on the car hood. James' pulse hammered in his ears. He did not flinch. The air was thick, electric. The officer glanced up, eyes catching the reflection of something. Proof, witness, accountability. His grin faded. The moment stretched. One decision could tip the scales entirely. James felt every past humiliation, every microaggression, every systemic injustice converge here. The officer's shadow loomed over him, power wielded carelessly, blindly. The radio crackled. Silence answered. And then, the first words. "So, identification." James gripped his briefcase tighter. The fluorescent lights of the precinct buzzed faintly, harsh and sterile. James Holloway's hands remained folded over his briefcase as the officer led him down a narrow corridor, the echo of their footsteps amplified by the empty hallways. The walls were a pale institutional green, scuffed at the edges, the air tinged with disinfectant and the faint metallic scent of anxiety. "Sit," the officer said, gesturing to a metal chair at a small table. The room was tight, suffocating, the kind of space designed to make anyone feel small. James lowered himself carefully, maintaining the calm he had practiced 1,000 times before. "You understand why we brought you in?" the officer asked, leaning on the table. His smirk was gone, replaced with a calculated edge, a predator testing the waters. "I don't," James replied evenly. "I was crossing the street. I have done nothing wrong." The officer's hand drummed lightly on the table. "That's what everyone says. You know, we get a lot of complaints about people who look the part but aren't what they seem." James recognized the coded language immediately. Every word was designed to undermine, to suggest guilt without evidence. He leaned forward slightly, letting his voice carry calm authority. "I am not required to prove myself to assumptions," he said. "I'm an attorney. My work is on the record. If you have questions about legality, I suggest you follow procedure, not prejudice." The officer laughed softly, but it was hollow. "An attorney, huh? You must think that shields you from what's real." From the corner of the room, 2 other officers lingered, arms crossed, expressions neutral. One glanced at a monitor, showing security footage from the street outside. James noted the cameras, the recording devices. Every move, every word, being captured. "You're not exactly making this easy," the lead officer said. "Maybe you don't understand how things work around here." James felt a familiar constriction in his chest, the pressure of systemic authority, the silent complicity of those who watch and do nothing. He breathed slowly, measuring his response. "Things work as they are supposed to work when law is followed. Bias and assumption do not constitute procedure," James said. His tone was deliberate, sharp. Every syllable was a statement, a boundary. The officer leaned back slightly, evaluating. "You've got a lot of nerve. People like you always do." James let silence answer, the room thick with unspoken judgment. He could see the officer struggling for control, trying to assert dominance without evidence. A phone buzzed. Another officer glanced down, eyes flicking toward James. Even in this confined space, James felt a small surge of agency. The knowledge that the moment was documented, that the officer's overreach could be exposed. "Do you have identification?" the officer asked again, almost reluctantly. James handed over his credentials. His calm contrasted with the simmering tension in the room. The officer examined them with a raised brow, the veneer of authority faltering. "You're serious, huh?" he muttered, more to himself than to James. "I am always serious about legality and accountability," James said, tone precise. The officer leaned forward once more. "Don't think this changes anything. People like you, thinking you can talk your way out of real situations, don't usually come out ahead." James' gaze met his directly. No fear, only a measured assertion of truth. The room held its breath with him, every camera angle, every hidden microphone, a silent witness. Finally, after what felt like hours and a few minutes, the officer stepped back, reluctantly. "We'll verify this," he said, tossing the ID onto the table. "Don't move." James remained seated, calm, aware that the moment was far from over. He could feel the pulse of injustice vibrating in the walls, in the fluorescent lights, in the officer's shadow stretching across the table. He could also feel something else, an awakening in the system itself, subtle but undeniable. The cameras, the other officers, the recording devices, they were all silent witnesses, ready to speak when he could not. The officer left the room briefly, leaving James alone with his thoughts. Each second stretched, heavy with anticipation and the knowledge that this was only the beginning. James adjusted his cufflinks, fingers brushing the gold. His mind catalogued every detail, the officer's tone, the coded language, the slight tremor in his hands when he thought no one was watching. Every small act of bias was now evidence. He leaned back in the chair, silent, observing, waiting. The door creaked. The officer returned, eyes sharper, the tension palpable. "You'd better hope this checks out," he said, dropping a folder onto the table. James opened it slowly. Inside, reports, statements, and a single line of suspicion written casually, but enough to continue the harassment. He didn't flinch. He would meet it all, bias, assumption, abuse of power, with calm, methodical resistance. James Holloway sat back in the metal chair, the flickering fluorescent light overhead casting harsh lines across his face. The folder the officer had left on the table sat open before him, full of reports designed to intimidate, to imply wrongdoing where there was none. He traced a finger along the edges of the pages, not reading them yet, but cataloging their intent: fear, leverage, control. His mind drifted briefly, pulling him back to law school, the late nights, the relentless study, the weight of being a black student in lecture halls dominated by voices that questioned his very presence. "Remember, James," his mentor had said once, voice gravelly but steady, "authority isn't given, it's claimed. And sometimes it is to be defended before it's recognized." He remembered standing in those crowded, echoing halls, every whisper a test, every smirk a subtle microaggression. One professor had remarked, loud enough for half the class to hear, "You're ambitious for someone like you." Ambitious. That single word had carried the weight of centuries of expectation and prejudice. James had held back his rebuttal, noting the words carefully, filing them in the mental archive of lessons in navigating systemic bias. The memory sharpened his current focus. This officer, like many before him, assumed privilege, or lack thereof, based solely on skin and attire. But James had been trained to navigate these moments, to wield his expertise like armor. Legal strategy had become second nature: anticipate, record, respond, assert. He thought at his first courtroom appearance as a young attorney, facing a panel of skeptical judges who questioned his competence before he spoke a single word. His voice had carried over their murmurs, clear, precise, unyielding. That same precision now guided his thoughts in the sterile interrogation room. A knock at the door pulled him back to the present. An officer entered with a coffee cup, eyes avoiding direct contact. James nodded curtly, returning focus to the folder. He would dissect every line of accusation, every insinuation, methodically. He had trained for this: cases of wrongful accusation, subtle coercion, and the systematic undermining of black professionals in positions of authority. The officer returned soon after, leaning against the doorframe. "You've been quiet, thinking over your excuses." James lifted his gaze, voice even but firm. "I am considering the proper response. Excuses are unnecessary where evidence dictates procedure." The officer's smirk faltered. James could see it, the crack in the assumed power. This was familiar territory, the overreach of authority confronted with precise knowledge. Every microaggression, every coded insult, every dismissive glance could be catalogued, referenced, and challenged. He recalled conversations with colleagues in the Attorney General's office, late-night strategy sessions where they dissected systemic failures, bias policing, institutional oversight, legal blind spots. Each colleague contributed knowledge, experience, and stories of injustice. They had armed James not just with law, but with insight into the human cost of unchecked authority. A particular mentor's voice echoed now. "Never let them see fear, James. Fear is the leverage they crave. Calm is the weapon." He adjusted his cufflinks, the familiar glint of gold grounding him in that lesson. He considered the officer across the hall, the power imbalance, the potential for escalation. His suit, polished shoes, and calm demeanor were irrelevant to the officer's assumptions. Only his methodical response could counteract the systemic bias pressing against him. James spoke softly, almost to himself, but deliberately enough that the officer could hear. "Every assumption, every unjust inference will be recorded and addressed. That is law, and that is accountability." The officer's posture shifted subtly, a mixture of frustration and unease. James knew the moment would pass, but the lesson endured. Authority wielded without knowledge or fairness was fragile when confronted with precision, experience, and moral clarity. He thought of his current position as Attorney General, the role he had fought for tirelessly. Every injustice he faced in this room was a microcosm of the systemic failures he sought to reform: bias, intimidation, and unowned authority. But now, in the center of that precinct, he had the tools, the knowledge, and the composure to assert accountability. The door creaked, a new officer entering to take statements. James greeted them with measured politeness, ensuring clarity, documenting tone, timing, and phrasing. Dialogue flowed not just as communication but as evidence, each word a shield against misrepresentation. As the officer leaned closer once more, attempting to reassert dominance, James met his gaze. Calm, unwavering. Every memory of prior injustice, every lesson learned, every courtroom victory, all converged in this moment. He did not flinch. He was armored in knowledge, experience, and resilience. The bias pressing against him would meet resistance not through anger, but through precision, strategy, and unwavering authority. The fluorescent light flickered again. James adjusted his tie, his posture straight, voice steady. "You may continue with your procedure," he said. "I am prepared." And for the first time in the room, the officer hesitated, the weight of James' legal and personal armor pressing silently between them. James Holloway stepped back onto the precinct's linoleum floor, the hum of fluorescent lights and distant murmurs of officers filling the air. The officer who had stopped him remained nearby, posture rigid, eyes flicking toward him with a mixture of suspicion and frustration. James' briefcase hung at his side, his hand steady on the handle, his mind calculating every possible move. "Let's be clear," James said evenly, voice cutting through the tension. "I'm not a suspect. I am an attorney, and I demand that this interaction be conducted with adherence to law and protocol." The officer's smirk returned, though tighter now, a strain showing at the edges. "You think throwing your title around makes a difference? People like you always think they can talk their way out of what's real." James' pulse remained measured. "I do not talk my way out, officer. I rely on evidence, procedure, and accountability. I am asking you to follow the law, not your assumptions." The officer leaned in slightly, a predatory tilt in his stance. "And if I don't?" James did not flinch. Silence carried weight, his composure amplifying the imbalance. Around them, other officers lingered, watching without intervening, a silent audience to a subtle display of power. Across the street, through the window, pedestrians paused. Some raised phones, capturing moments that could ripple far beyond this block. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," the officer muttered, voice low, almost a hiss. He gestured vaguely toward James' tailored suit. "Dress like that, thinking you're untouchable. People like you are easy targets when they step off their pedestal." James adjusted the briefcase strap, eyes narrowing slightly. "You presume. You stereotype. You assert authority without justification. That is not power. That is prejudice." A passerby on the sidewalk raised a phone, discreetly recording. James' eyes flicked to the screen, noting the angle, the glow reflecting in a puddle at his polished shoes. One small act, yet it carried potential consequences that extended far beyond the street. The officer's smirk faltered as James' gaze met his directly, unwavering. "Step back," James said quietly, almost under his breath, yet sharp enough to command attention. "Every word, every gesture here is being documented. You are accountable for your actions." The officer's jaw tightened, the tension in his shoulders betraying his composure. He reached for his radio, fingers brushing against the buttons as if to summon backup, but hesitated. James sensed the moment, the awareness that exposure could dismantle the assumed power in an instant. "You think you can intimidate me with threats?" James asked, voice steady, deliberate. "Intimidation does not supersede law. Bias does not constitute authority." A bystander stepped closer, a quiet presence holding a phone aloft, recording. The officer's eyes flicked toward the device, awareness dawning. The smirk vanished entirely. He weighed his options, calculating risk, but his training and authority conflicted with the reality of exposure. James' voice remained calm but unyielding. "You are accountable. Every action, every word, every assumption will be examined. This is not about confrontation. It is about law, justice, and integrity." The officer's hand twitched toward the car again, indecision in every movement. He glanced at the onlookers, the recording devices, the slight murmurs of the crowd. For the first time, he hesitated fully, recognition flickering in his eyes. The assumed power of uniform and position faltered under the weight of documentation and clarity. "Though, you're serious," the officer said finally, almost muttering, as though admitting a truth he did not wish to face. "I am always serious about accountability," James replied. His posture remained straight, calm, commanding. Each word was deliberate, each pause a reinforcement of presence and authority. The tension stretched across the street and into the surrounding alleys, every small gesture magnified. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, indecision rippling through him. James noticed a subtle shift in the shadows cast by the streetlights, the slight tremor in his opponent's stance. Power, James realized, was fragile when confronted by preparation, presence, and principle. "You should know," James added, lowering his voice so that only the officer could hear, "your actions are visible, not just to me, but to everyone around us. Every word, every decision, recorded, witnessed, accountable." The officer exhaled sharply, finally stepping back from the implied threat, his hands dropping to his sides. He met James' gaze briefly, the tension in his face unmistakable. Around them, onlookers watched silently, some still recording, some whispering, their attention shifting the balance of power further. James adjusted his tie, feeling the familiar weight of composure, training, and legal acumen as a shield. The officer, now aware of exposure, hesitated again before speaking into his radio, the first signs of restraint in his tone. James remained still, calm, unshaken. Each second stretched, heavy with anticipation and the unspoken acknowledgement that authority and tempered by justice could crumble under scrutiny. He had turned the power play into a test of accountability, and the officer had begun to falter. The city hummed around them, indifferent yet bearing witness. And in that fleeting tension, James knew the first cracks had appeared. By the time James Holloway left the precinct, the morning sun was cresting over the downtown skyline, painting the streets in harsh gold and shadow. He adjusted the strap of his briefcase, walking with measured steps, aware of every passerby, every car, every whisper of attention. He had been released, officially cleared pending verification. But the encounter had left its mark, a reminder how quickly bias could escalate into abuse, even when he was fully aware, fully prepared. Across the street, a passerby's phone glowed. The video, captured in subtle angles, would soon spread. James didn't yet know the speed of virality, the ripple that would carry the story from a corner of downtown to national attention. He did know one thing. He had prepared for this, mentally and legally. His mind catalogued every detail, the officer's tone, the words chosen, the microaggressions, the implied threats. Every syllable would become evidence, a record of the power wielded without accountability. Within hours, the video had appeared online. Social media erupted, comments, shares, and hashtags amplifying the incident. Racial profiling downtown trended. Journalists scrambled, news outlets filed breaking stories, an expert waiting on systemic bias in law enforcement. James watched silently from his office, the glow of the computer screen reflecting in his eyes. His phone buzzed incessantly, messages from colleagues, aides, and concerned citizens. Each ping a reminder of the stakes, the scrutiny, and the necessity of careful, precise action. He called a communications director, giving instructions. Statements must be accurate, measured, and legally sound. "We do not speculate," he said. "We state the facts, the evidence, and the actions taken. We hold accountable, but we do not inflame." His voice was calm, authoritative, every word deliberate. The emotional weight pressed against him, though. He felt the lingering sting of humiliation, the echo of the officer's assumptions, and the reminder that systemic bias did not vanish because of position or preparation. Each message he read, each news clip he watched, carried a collective outrage and empathy of society beginning to see what he had endured countless times before. Journalists arrived at the Attorney General's office, microphones poised, cameras rolling. James stepped forward, suit pristine, demeanor composed. "This morning, I was stopped by a police officer while conducting personal business," he began. The room fell silent, the sound of a recorder clicking faintly in the background. The stop was unwarranted. The officer acted on assumptions based on my appearance. This is not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of systemic bias that must be addressed. Questions came fast, sharp, probing. Do you feel threatened? Will there be an investigation? Do you think this reflects wider patterns? James answered each precisely, refusing to let emotion undermine clarity. Every phrase was measured, every pause intentional. His words were not just explanation, they were documentation, testimony, and a call for accountability. Back on the street where the encounter had occurred, the original video continued to spread. Local news stations looped the footage, commentators dissecting the officer's behavior, the legal implications, and the societal context. Bystanders who had recorded additional angles came forward, corroborating James' account. Each new clip added weight to the narrative of systemic injustice. Meanwhile, James reflected privately on the personal toll. The humiliation, though mitigated by position and preparation, was real. The fear of what could have happened, the reminder of vulnerability, and the emotional labor required to remain composed weighed heavily. Yet, he also felt resolve. This incident could serve as leverage for broader change. Every act of exposure, every public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, was a step towards systemic reform. He reviewed the office's legal strategy, formal complaints filed, evidence catalogued, oversight bodies notified. Accountability would not be symbolic. It would be procedural, thorough, and inescapable. He had faced resistance before, biased judges, dismissive colleagues, subtle undermining, and emerged through preparation, resilience, and meticulous adherence to law. This was no different. By evening, national outlets carried the story. Tweets, articles, and live reports amplified the narrative. A black man, professionally attired, harassed by an officer emblematic of broader systemic bias. James watched the coverage, noting inaccuracies, omissions, and subtle framing. He composed a statement for social media, emphasizing facts, accountability, and systemic patterns, carefully balancing public outrage with legal precision. Still, even in the midst of exposure, there was a human cost. James felt the weight of scrutiny, the emotional exhaustion, and the lingering fear that authority could once again misinterpret or escalate. His resilience was tested not by confrontation alone, but by the societal spotlight, the expectation to remain calm, precise, and unwavering in the face of both injustice and public attention. He paused, glancing out the office window at the city below. The same streets where assumptions had nearly trapped him were now alive with cameras, witnesses, and a digital archive of accountability. Justice, slow and procedural, had begun its work. Yet, the struggle was far from over. The officer remained unaccountable formally. The institution had yet to act decisively. James knew the battle would extend beyond this single incident. Through investigations, public discourse, and legal oversight, every step, every word, every action mattered. And James Holloway, steadfast in composure and fortified by experience, prepared for the next phase. Exposure had begun. The reckoning would follow. The morning was heavy with bureaucratic tension when James Holloway returned to the Attorney General's office. His steps were deliberate, each footfall echoing against the polished marble floors, a rhythm of resolve and calculation. Emails had piled overnight, internal investigators requesting statements, legal aid preparing documentation, and colleagues strategizing the broader implications of the viral incident. James settled at his desk, reviewing compiled evidence, videos, eyewitness accounts, audio from the precinct, and his own detailed notes from the interaction. Every word, every gesture from the officer had been catalogued. Each microaggression, every assertion of unwarranted authority, was carefully documented to construct a clear, indisputable case. A knock at the door heralded the arrival of two senior investigators. Their expressions were professional, cautious, aware that the situation demanded both legal precision and institutional sensitivity. Mr. Holloway, one began, voice measured. We are reviewing the incident. Your statement is detailed. We have the video evidence and witness corroboration. The officer's conduct raises serious concerns regarding procedural compliance and bias. James nodded, maintaining composure. I trust the review will be thorough. This is about accountability, not just isolated reprimand. Patterns matter. Systemic failures cannot be ignored. The investigators exchanged a glance. We understand. There will be internal reviews, interviews, and oversight measures. However, institutional inertia can delay action. We may encounter resistance. James' gaze hardened. He had seen it before, officers protecting their own, subtle cover-ups, and procedural delays that diluted justice. Resistance is expected, he said evenly. Evidence, documentation, and legal oversight must outweigh deference to authority. That is the standard. Dialogue became the tool of leverage. Each conversation with internal affairs, oversight committees, and senior staff was precise, deliberate. James articulated the impact of systemic bias on both individuals and institutions. He highlighted the officer's repeated assertions, microaggressions, and the public nature of the incident, ensuring every nuance was understood. The investigators nodded, taking notes. Your position allows you to apply pressure beyond standard protocol, one said. The public scrutiny also reinforces accountability. James reflected on that. Exposure had been instrumental, but systemic change required more than viral videos. It demanded procedural rigor, transparency, and unwavering persistence. Legal strategy and moral clarity had to intersect to hold authority accountable. He recalled similar cases early in his career, where institutional resistance stymied justice despite evidence. Each experience had been a lesson in patience, strategy, and the necessity of documentation. In his role as Attorney General, James had both the authority and the knowledge to ensure follow-through. Meetings continued throughout the day. He conferred with aides, drafted formal complaints, and coordinated with internal investigators. Dialogue dominated. Questions, clarifications, procedural points, each word serving to reinforce accountability. He emphasized the officer's misuse of authority, the emotional and social impact of the harassment, and the need for clear disciplinary measures. The pressure was immense. Every statement he approved, every procedural step he monitored, carried the weight of precedent. Failure to act decisively could reinforce systemic bias, while careful action could signal meaningful reform. By mid-afternoon, the first preliminary measures were in place. The officer was temporarily reassigned pending investigation, and additional training and oversight were mandated. James knew these steps were only the beginning. True accountability required continued scrutiny, evidence-backed reporting, and public transparency. Even with these measures, tension persisted. Other officers in the precinct whispered, aware that their colleagues' conduct and the institutional response was being closely monitored. James had shifted the balance. Authority was now measured against accountability, public scrutiny, and procedural rigor. He walked through the office late in the day, observing colleagues at their desks. Discussions about policy reform, systemic oversight, and anti-bias measures filled the air. The incident had catalyzed a broader awareness. Dialogue, strategy, and evidence were shaping institutional consciousness. James reflected quietly in his office. The emotional toll lingered, the initial confrontation, the humiliation, the stress of managing public exposure. Yet, he also recognized progress. The system, flawed as it was, could respond effectively when confronted with clarity, evidence, and unwavering persistence. Later, he addressed a meeting with department heads. Accountability is not optional, he said firmly. Authority without oversight leads to injustice. This incident is not isolated. It represents patterns we must disrupt. Compliance, transparency, and moral clarity are our obligations. Heads nodded, some cautiously, some resolutely. James sensed a subtle shift. The institutional inertia he had anticipated was yielding to procedure and exposure. The officer's behavior, once hidden behind assumed authority, could no longer operate without consequence. By evening, James returned to his office, reviewing the day's progress. The viral video, public statements, and internal actions were converging into a coordinated response. Every conversation, every procedural step, every documented word contributed to a narrative of accountability. And yet, James knew the reckoning was ongoing. The officer remained formally unpunished, and institutional patterns required vigilance. True change demanded continued pressure, meticulous documentation, and unwavering commitment. He allowed himself a brief pause, a moment to breathe. The system was beginning to respond, but the work was far from complete. Exposure had opened the door. Institutional reckoning would require persistence, strategy, and the courage to confront entrenched bias wherever it surfaced. James Holloway rose, adjusted his chute, and prepared for the next phase. The officer's authority was faltering, but accountability required precision, patience, and relentless oversight. The battle was far from over, but the first cracks in systemic impunity had begun to form. Weeks passed since the viral incident, but James Holloway remained vigilant. The officer who had harassed him faced mounting scrutiny, both internally and publicly. Every report, every statement, every bystander video had been catalogued meticulously. The procedural wheels turned slowly but inevitably, a measure of accountability finally catching up to the abuse of authority. James watched the internal investigation unfold from his office. Investigators reviewed precinct records, personnel files, and prior complaints. Colleagues confirmed patterns of bias that the officer had displayed repeatedly, even in minor interactions. Every omission, every casual disregard for procedure now worked against him. The weight of evidence was undeniable. By midweek, the officer was formally suspended without pay. The news broke across media channels, juxtaposing his authority with his misconduct. Public response was immediate. Social media amplified the suspension, and citizens debated the broader implications of systemic bias in law enforcement. James reflected on the emotional toll. The humiliation, anxiety, and tension had not vanished, even with the officer's suspension. Exposure and procedural justice had addressed the external consequences, but the internal scars, awareness of vulnerability, the stress of confrontation, and the burden of public responsibility remained. Poetic justice, he realized, did not erase trauma. It merely acknowledged wrongdoing and imposed accountability. A community forum convened shortly after, with James as a keynote speaker. Residents, activists, and officials attended, sharing stories of bias, intimidation, and fear. Dialogue dominated the session, revealing patterns that often went unnoticed, minor assumptions escalating into harassment, silence from bystanders, and reluctance from institutions to act without exposure. James addressed the gathering with deliberate calm. Accountability is not symbolic. It is procedural, documented, and enforced. Authority must never operate unchecked. Every act of bias we confront today shapes the culture we leave for tomorrow. The forum highlighted institutional failures and inspired actionable reform. Training programs, oversight measures, and policy adjustments were scheduled. The officer's colleagues faced evaluations and mandatory bias awareness sessions. The precinct could no longer ignore systemic deficiencies under the weight of public attention and institutional enforcement. Yet, James' personal life felt a residual tension. Each day required measured composure, patience in media interactions, and careful management of his team. Even as justice progressed externally, the emotional labor persisted. Every smile, every statement, every handshake carried a memory of confrontation and the knowledge of what he had endured. The officer, once confident in his unchallenged authority, now faced formal reprimand, public censure, and institutional measures that would shape his career permanently. His peers avoided eye contact, aware of the scrutiny and the consequences of association. Authority without accountability, James observed, crumbles under exposure, documentation, and persistent challenge. In the quiet of his office late one evening, James reflected on the journey. Legal expertise, preparation, composure, and moral clarity had transformed an unjust confrontation into systemic reform. Dialogue, strategy, and public exposure had aligned to ensure both accountability and awareness. He allowed himself a brief moment of solitude, considering the cost, emotional exhaustion, the weight of public scrutiny, and the reminder that systemic bias required constant vigilance. Victory, in this instance, had a price. Justice had been served procedurally, but the scars of experience remained etched in memory. James adjusted his suit jacket, standing by the window overlooking the city. The streets where assumptions had once threatened to trap him now thrummed with witnesses, cameras, and the persistent hum of civic life. Change was incremental, fragile, yet undeniable. Patterns that had been invisible were now illuminated, and systemic awareness had grown. The officer would continue his career under the shadow of accountability, a visible reminder to colleagues and subordinates that power without principle carries consequences. James, reinforced by experience and resilience, had catalyzed reform without vengeance, asserting the rule of law and moral clarity over impulse. As night fell, James walked alone along the quiet streets, briefcase in hand, the glow of streetlights reflecting in puddles. He felt the lingering weight of trauma and the subtle satisfaction of justice tempered by restraint. Poetic justice, he understood, was not revenge. It was balance restored through exposure, procedure, and moral rigor. Every encounter, every microaggression, every subtle assertion of bias had been met with measured resistance, now resulting in tangible change. Authority had been confronted, systemic patterns challenged, and accountability enforced. James paused on the sidewalk, taking in the stillness of the city, the shadows of the streetlights casting long, fractured reflections. The struggle was ongoing, the work far from complete, but the first cracks in entrenched injustice had been made visible. And in that quiet moment, he understood the price, the labor, and the lasting impact of principled resistance. The city woke slowly, pale sunlight spilling over streets still damp from the morning mist. James Holloway sat at his desk in the Attorney General's office, papers and reports stacked neatly around him. The officer's suspension had been finalized, the procedural steps documented, and public statements made. Yet James did not feel the relief he had anticipated. He reviewed the files one last time, witness statements, video evidence, internal reports. Every word, gesture, and action had been catalogued, every breach of protocol and bias meticulously documented. The work had ensured accountability, but the memory of the encounter still pressed against him like a weight he could not set aside. James reflected on the weeks of exposure, public scrutiny, and institutional engagement. The press conferences, the internal investigations, the community forums, all had demanded composure and relentless focus. Each moment of calm, each measured response, had been a deliberate exercise in asserting authority through knowledge rather than emotion. Yet the psychological toll was real. The sense of vulnerability, the awareness of systemic bias, and the persistent reminder how quickly assumptions could turn into harassment lingered. He recognized that resilience came at a cost, and that justice, even when achieved, did not erase the personal strain endured. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. One of his aides entered, holding an update on pending reforms across several precincts. Policies for bias training, procedural transparency, and internal accountability were being drafted. James nodded, scanning the documents. Each reform was a step towards systemic change, yet he knew implementation would demand ongoing oversight. So, the aide said cautiously, public response remains intense. Social media, news outlets, they're still discussing the officer and the incident. Citizens are watching closely. James leaned back in his chair, hands folded over his briefcase. They should be. Accountability is not a one-time event. It is a persistent process. Public attention ensures vigilance, and vigilance ensures compliance. He thought of the officer, once overconfident, once assuming that authority provided immunity. Now, suspension, censure, and scrutiny defined his existence within the system. The balance of power had shifted, not through vengeance, but through exposure, procedure, and moral clarity. Authority had been tested, and accountability had prevailed. James considered the broader patterns illuminated by the incident. Microaggressions, coded language, and subtle bias were often invisible, dismissed, or normalized. Yet their cumulative effect eroded trust, compromised fairness, and perpetuated systemic inequities. By confronting this single episode with precision and rigor, he had created a precedent, proof that structured response could disrupt entrenched patterns. Later, in a meeting with senior advisors, James outlined the next steps: implementation of policy reforms, enhanced training, and monitoring of precinct conduct would continue. Change is incremental, he stated. Every act of accountability strengthens the institution, educates the personnel, and protects the public. This is the work that follows exposure, the work that prevents recurrence. Even as the city moved forward, James reflected privately on the personal cost. The encounter had demanded not only legal expertise but emotional control, strategic patience, and moral clarity. Resilience had been tested repeatedly. Each public statement, each internal directive, each procedural step had required careful calibration of tone, authority, and principle. He understood now that justice, true justice, was not instantaneous. It required persistence, clarity, and unwavering commitment. It demanded that individuals confront bias with documentation, dialogue, and deliberate action. Authority and tempered by these principles was fragile, but when held accountable, it could be reoriented toward fairness and equity. James glanced out the window at the street below, the familiar hum of the city a constant reminder of the world he served. Authority, he reflected, was not merely a title or uniform. It was responsibility, accountability, and vigilance. Misuse of power, left unchecked, had consequences. Confrontation, tempered by composure and legal precision, could transform injustice into systemic awareness and reform. He felt a quiet resolve settle within him. The personal toll, the stress, and the scrutiny were part of the process, a necessary weight for meaningful change. The officer's suspension was a milestone, but it was only one moment in the ongoing struggle against bias, inequity, and abuse of power. As James prepared to leave the office, he reflected on the lessons learned. Authority challenged by knowledge and procedure could be held accountable. Exposure amplified responsibility. Resilience was both personal and systemic. Justice, though procedural, had tangible impact. He stepped into the cool evening air, briefcase in hand, city lights reflecting off wet pavement. The encounter, the exposure, and the resulting reforms had tested him in ways both professional and deeply personal. Yet he walked forward with clarity and determination, aware that vigilance, persistence, and principled action were the foundations of enduring change. And though the city would continue to hum with the patterns of life, James Holloway carried the knowledge that even one act of courage, prepared with precision and grounded in law, could ripple outward, challenging assumptions, confronting bias, and shaping the course of justice. Weeks had turned into months. The initial viral video had faded from the headlines, but its impact persisted. James Holloway walked through the halls of the Attorney General's office with measured calm, observing colleagues immersed in reports, policy drafts, and community outreach plans. The weight of the incident had shifted from personal confrontation to systemic reform. The officer responsible for the harassment remained suspended, facing internal disciplinary proceedings. Colleagues whispered cautiously about his diminished authority, aware that his actions were now a case study in professional accountability. The suspension, coupled with mandatory bias training and oversight, served as a precedent, proof that abuse of power would no longer go unchecked. James reflected on the broader implications. The public exposure, the careful documentation, and the strategic response had catalyzed more than punitive action. They had sparked institutional awareness. Precincts across the state were reviewing stop-and-search protocols, implementing bias awareness training, and revisiting policies to ensure transparency and accountability. Dialogue between law enforcement and community representatives had intensified, fostering a culture of accountability and vigilance. He entered a conference room filled with staff and community leaders. Maps, reports, and procedural manuals lay spread across the table. The work does not end with a single suspension, James said, voice steady, authoritative. Systemic change is iterative. Every interaction, every decision, every encounter is an opportunity to reinforce fairness and integrity. A junior investigator raised a point about ongoing cases where bias might influence outcomes. James listened carefully, nodding. Each case is an opportunity for transparency. Documentation, review, and accountability are non-negotiable. Our responsibility extends beyond reactive measures. It is proactive, continuous, and principled. The room absorbed the weight of his words. Authority, James understood, was a tool that could be wielded responsibly or abused. The officer's harassment had exposed vulnerabilities in both the system and the culture of policing. Now, with careful oversight, those vulnerabilities were being addressed. Later, James reflected privately on the personal costs. The confrontation, the viral exposure, and the media attention had exacted an emotional toll. He had navigated humiliation, scrutiny, and the persistent tension of public responsibility. Yet these experiences had also fortified his resolve, sharpened his strategic thinking, and clarified his purpose. Resilience was measured not by the absence of challenge, but by the capacity to confront bias with precision, composure, and legal authority. He recalled the initial moment of confrontation, the officer's assumptions, the coded language, the implied threat. Each microaggression, cataloged and analyzed, had become a building block for accountability. James recognized that such encounters were not isolated. They reflected systemic patterns that required sustained intervention. The city outside pulsed with life. Police patrols continued. Streets bustled with pedestrians, and traffic hummed along familiar arteries. Authority, once exercised without oversight, was now tempered by visibility, procedural checks, and public consciousness. James observed these rhythms with the awareness that vigilance was continuous. Patterns of bias could re-emerge if not confronted with diligence and integrity. A call came from a community leader requesting a meeting to discuss long-term strategies for police oversight and community engagement. James agreed immediately. Dialogue, he believed, was essential not only for accountability but for prevention. Proactive measures, collaboration, and transparency would fortify the reforms inspired by his personal confrontation. Walking to the meeting, James reflected on the intersection of personal experience and systemic change. One encounter, initially humiliating and threatening, had catalyzed reforms, heightened awareness, and reinforced the principle that authority carries responsibility. Exposure, combined with precise documentation and strategic action, had reshaped the narrative. At the meeting, community representatives shared stories of minor biases escalating into harassment, frustrations with opaque procedures, and fears of retaliation. James listened, responded, and guided the discussion with legal clarity and empathetic authority. Each exchange reinforced accountability and demonstrated that the office prioritized justice over convenience, principle over complacency. By evening, James returned to his office, reviewing policies and reports. The officer's suspension was firm, and plans for permanent reforms were underway. Training programs, reporting mechanisms, and procedural oversight would embed accountability into institutional culture. He paused, reflecting on the arc of events. From personal harassment to public exposure, from internal investigation to systemic reform, the trajectory had demanded composure, resilience, and unwavering commitment to principle. Justice, procedural and moral, had been asserted, but its endurance relied on continued vigilance. James adjusted his tie, glanced at the city skyline, and felt a quiet sense of resolution. Authority misuse had been confronted, bias exposed, and accountability enforced. The work of reform would continue, but the foundations had been laid. Exposure, documentation, and principled action were powerful tools for enduring change. He left the office, briefcase in hand, walking through streets illuminated by the glow of streetlights. The city, indifferent yet alive, bore witness to the ongoing struggle between authority and accountability, bias and justice. James Holloway understood that his role was not just to respond to injustice, but to anticipate, prevent, and guide systemic integrity. And though challenges remained, the balance of power had shifted. Authority, once assumed unconditionally, now faced scrutiny and responsibility. Bias had been challenged, and accountability, tempered by law and principle, had begun to endure. James paused on the sidewalk, taking in the quiet rhythm of the city. He had faced humiliation, confrontation, and exposure. He had endured scrutiny, pressure, and the personal cost of public responsibility. Yet he had catalyzed systemic change, ensured accountability, and reinforced the principle that power without oversight is fragile. The night was still, but the city's pulse was steady. Authority had been tested, injustice confronted, and reform initiated. And in that moment, James Holloway walked forward with clarity, resolve, and the quiet certainty that principled action, grounded in law and moral clarity, could reshape institutions and endure beyond a single incident.